Hi guys! So today we're going to be looking at the process of explicating a poem and crafting a thesis statement from that. And we're going to be using Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare as an example of this to go through the process. Alright, so the first step in this process is of course to read the poem. So I'm just going to read it to you and you can follow along with this cursor to read with me. So we start with the title, Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Now the title calls this a sonnet, which is important because we know from background information that a sonnet is comprised of 4 quatrains followed by a final couplet in the rhyme scheme AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG, which is clearly seen throughout the poem here. My first step in the explication process is usually to go through the rhyme scheme and the meter. So next I've used scansion to find out which syllables are stressed and which are unstressed. And I've used the symbols here of this shape and this shape to indicate that. Sonnets are written in iambic pentameter, which means unstressed and stressed, and 5 groups of that, which this sonnet follows to a T. Often, a sonneteer will digress from the meter in order to emphasize certain words, but in this sonnet, there's no cases of that, which is very interesting, so we should write that down. Alright, so I removed the markings so that they do not clutter up our annotations, but we know that there's no metric variation because we marked that down there. So the next clear step is to determine what exactly the sonnet is saying. So we're going to take this quatrain by quatrain in order to break it up into some smaller components. There's Happy Shakespeare in the corner saying, "Yeah, go you analyze my poem." He kind of looks like a girl, and he has a butt chin, but, that's fine. He's still rooting for you through his 1950s women's haircut. Oh, whatever, I thought it was funny. In the first quatrain, he's essentially saying, let me compare you to summer. He's saying that even when you're compared to summer, something that has a connotation of being beautiful and calm, you outshine it in both of those categories. He then goes on to list some of the negatives of summer, saying that rough winds shake the beautiful flowers you see. And there's a little bit of contrast here, using the word rough and then the word darling within the same line. And unlike you, he's saying, summer's so short. You might notice that just as the summer they're describing is brief, they use all short words when describing it, which makes the line go very quickly. Now, these things that we're marking down now, like this contrast and the shortness of these words, these are just observations that we're making as we're reading the poem. And after we go through each line and go back out to the poem as a whole, we can try and piece those together and find some significance or something that connects the two. And that's what's going to help us find our thesis statement. All right, cool, Shakespeare's back. Looks basically just like my other drawing, right? Whew, let's just go into the corner here. So the first 2 lines here, much like the last 2 lines of the first quatrain, are continuing to list negative things about summer that the speaker sees. He's saying that it's too hot and that often it's cloudy out. But wait, you might ask, how did we get that it's too cloudy out from this line? It says his. Who's he? To answer that question, we go back to the first line, where we see the subject is the eye of heaven. Since it's saying that it's shining too brightly and it's getting too hot, the reader is read to believe that they're talking about the sun. So if they're talking about the sun, and they're using the pronoun his, that means that they must be using personification. So let's just mark that down on the side. The next 2 lines are saying that everything beautiful will eventually stop being that way, whether that's by chance or just nature's course. And we just see some repetition of the word fair within the line. But your beauty, unlike the beauty of summer, is eternal. It's not going to go away when fall comes along. Nothing can ever take it away. It's yours. Death, or the devil, is never going to be bragging that you're in hell with him. Because time cannot affect you once you're written down in these lines. So right away, I've been looking at these 4 lines. We see the repetition of the word eternal. We see personification of death, because, of course, death itself can't brag. Here the speaker establishes himself as being the one who's writing the poem. So essentially, he's telling us that he's both the sonneteer and the speaker. Another important word to look at in this final line is time. There are some important questions to ask yourself while you're reading a poem. And one of those questions that I find often yields results key to unlocking the meaning of the poem is what words stand out, what words could carry double meaning. Although it's true that time is capitalized here, in Shakespearean times, there was a slightly different set of grammar rules, so this capitalization might not mean anything to the meaning. However, since we're talking about eternal lines, we're talking about poetry, and we know that timing is connected to this, time in this sentence might have an additional meaning to the time that we initially think of. It refers to the meter and to the rhyme, to the rhythm at which you read the poem. Additionally, this but, as the first word of the quatrain, signals a turning point or a shift in the poem. And this brings us to the final couplet. In Shakespearean sonnets, the final couplet often holds meaning, either as a turning point or a conclusive literary device. In this case, he's saying that as long as the human race is here, your beauty will live on. And it's this beauty that gives me life and purpose. We see a repetition of the first 2 words in these 2 lines. And I'd say pretty confidently that that serves to emphasize these 2 lines and show that they hold meaning. That's another question that you should be asking yourself each time you find something in a sonnet that stands out to you. Why would the poet do this? What purpose does it serve? This why, the effect of the literary device, is going to be what ties in what you find in the poem to your thesis. Okay, so let's now look back at the poem as a whole. So here we have the original poem with all of our annotations on it. From this point on, I like to ask myself, what themes do I see in the poem? And of these, which stands out the most to me? Which seems most important and which is speaking to me? So the first theme that jumps out at me is this idea that human beauty is better than the beauty seen in nature. The second theme that I see is in the next half of the poem, and that's that poetry has the power to immortalize anything. When crafting a thesis statement, it's probably best to stick to just one of these themes. And personally, since the second theme is seen in the final couplet, I find that one to be the most powerful, so I'm just going to focus on that one. But you really could use either one and craft a strong thesis statement from it. Since this theme is seen from this point onwards, we're going to be paying special attention to those lines. So now is the time to review what stood out to you in those lines, why you think the sonneteer made those decisions, and to the idea that poetry can immortalize its subjects. So, repeating these words would enhance the theme. That's good! We found our first connection. Another observation we made is that there's no metric variations. This is seen throughout the poem, but of course it still applies in this final quatrain and couplet. So what's the effect of this decision? Well, when there's no change in the rhythm of the lines, that pattern does start to feel kind of endless, doesn't it? So you could say that sound echoes sense, and that the meter serves to additionally enhance the theme, in that it makes its pattern seem endless, just as the poem and the ideas that it holds will be shared an endless number of times. Alright, now comes the fun part, crafting our thesis statement. Let's make sure it's a hit, that it shows what the poet's doing, how he's doing it, and conveys the themes he's trying to share. Let's start with I, insight. What insightful thoughts do we find that the poem projects? As we said earlier, we found that poetry has the power to eternize its subjects. But how does it do this? Let's go back. The first way we said the poem enhances this theme is through repetition. both of the word eternal and of the phrase so long. When a phrase is repeated at the beginning of lines like this, it's a specific type of repetition called anaphora. So our first solution to the H is that the poet uses repetition of the word eternal and anaphora of the phrase so long to emphasize this timeless power of poetry. Our second solution to the H is the lack of variations in meter throughout the poem, which is actually uncommon in sonnets. Using the same rhythm over and over again makes the reader feel like that pattern really is endless. Now let's write that down. Next we move on to the theme, which is often closely tied to the insight. I'd say the theme is that poetry is an immortalizer. And here we have our final thesis statement, which we can prove through evidence we found in the sonnet. It reads, through the respective interline and anaphoric repetition of the phrases eternal and so long, coupled with a stress pattern following strict iambic pentameter, Shakespeare is able to emphasize his idea presented that his sonnet will immortalize the beauty of his subject, suggesting that poetry has the power to eternize its ideas. And that, my friends, is how you analyze poetry and craft a strong, arguable thesis statement from it.